Hello friends! In today's video I wanted to share with you how to create beautiful hand lettering with basic kids art markers. If you have ever felt like you need expensive tools or brush pens to create beautiful lettering, then you are going to love this. I wanted to create this video in kind of a practice with me style, so if you have a marker, go ahead and grab some paper and you can practice with me. I am using a couple of different worksheets, but you can follow along even if you don't have them. So I'm going to start with drills or basic strokes. If you are not familiar with basic strokes, they are essentially what makes up a lot of shapes in the letters that we create. So while some of these just look like squiggly lines, they actually can be combined to form certain letters. When I was first doing these upstrokes, I was just kind of moving my wrist to create this line, and that is not how I recommend doing it, but then I corrected myself and my lines did get a bit smoother, because at the beginning they were starting out thin and getting thicker because I was making this motion with my wrist and kind of losing the steadiness in my stroke. And then here, these ones I did with a more straightened wrist and moved my arm when I needed to move on to a different part of the page. So that's why I practice, because I get it wrong sometimes and need to correct myself. And that's why it's helpful for me, even as someone who has been lettering for a decently long time, to come back to drills because I forget how to do things sometimes too. And now this is not to say that my wrist does not ever move, but before I was just going up and down with my wrist, but when I let my arm do more of the work, like here you can watch my wrist, you can see how much more steady it was, minus the first one where my marker got stuck, but you get the idea. You can also see that when I do it the wrong way, my ends are choppy and it's just not a great look. And again, I'm moving my wrist a little bit, I'm just not using it as a way to get a good range of motion. For this one, it's okay if you want to lift up your pen in between each stroke. I hadn't done drills for a while before this, and it's definitely showing at the beginning, but then I warmed up a bit, and that's why drills are such a great place to start for practice. For these, I'm definitely going to lift up my pen. You can do it without lifting up your pen, but because I'm using this marker, the ends don't connect well. So it's just up to you. You'll notice sometimes my pen tip gets bent, and that's okay. It is just a characteristic of these markers and is completely normal because these markers weren't necessarily made for hand lettering. So I simply rotate my pen when it's feeling a bit stuck to one side and then it gets better. If you watch my wrist, I'm not moving a lot. When I need to make a movement, I'm moving my whole arm. And this is important because it's one of the things that helps me to have smoother strokes. Ovals are hard. A lot of people start ovals at the top and then struggle to connect them. I'll give you an example of this first, but this is not what I recommend. It can be hard because you're trying to connect a stroke that's in a transitional part. So for example, the right hand side of the oval is thin and the left hand side is thick, but right at the top is where you're transitioning from one to the other. So it can be hard to get the sizing the same from start to finish to where it meets up nicely. So what I do is I start over here on the right hand side or like the 3 o'clock spot and I go from there. That way I have plenty of time to make my stroke thin again and try to connect it in a more precise way. You can even draw up into it a little bit if that makes it easier, but you also don't need to do that a lot of times when you're doing ovals if you start from this spot. The reason for this is because most often when you're creating an oval in hand lettering, the connection will actually get covered up if you start here on the right side. So if you're doing an O, you're going to cover it up. If you're doing an A, you're going to cover it up. Or if you're doing a G, it's also going to be covered up. But let's say that we do a G from this first one where I started at the top. That's not going to cover our transition. But if you have that connection over here, then it doesn't really matter once you add your next stroke or the bottom part of your G because it gets hidden when you draw over it. So even depending on how you do your O's, that can still be hidden. So that's another trick and reason why I like to start it from the side, because even if you don't get it perfect, no one's really going to see it. This stroke can be really hard, at least that's what people tell me, but just go nice and slow, and if you need to, go ahead and lift up your marker, and that might make it a little bit easier for you. So in brush lettering, certain strokes are going to be thick and certain strokes are going to be thin. This depends on which way you're writing the stroke. So if you're not sure, this will help you figure out when to have a thicker stroke and when to have a thinner stroke. If you're going down when you draw, it's called a downstroke. And if you're going back up when you draw, it's called an upstroke. Your downstrokes are going to be the thick ones, and they're going to be thicker than your upstrokes. The way you achieve this is not by changing the position of your brush pen or marker. Sometimes people think that you write on the side for a downstroke and then switch it to write on the tip for an upstroke, but that's not actually the way that I do it. Instead, it's actually done by applying more pressure when you're writing downward on your paper. If you're not sure what I mean by down, it's basically when you're bringing the pen towards yourself. So in order to create these thicker strokes, you simply push harder. But if you've ever tried this as a beginner, you might be thinking, that's actually not so simple. And you're totally right, this wasn't easy for me when I first started either. So the way that we get better at this is really just practice. Sure, there may be some people who grab a hold of this quickly, but for most of us, this is a process of just practicing and practicing and practicing. If you are brand new to hand lettering and haven't been through my free 7-day beginner hand lettering course, I will leave a link in the description box because I included some free worksheets in that course, and they will also work with these markers. So if you haven't joined that free course, definitely head there when this video is over because I've got lots more beginner hand lettering tips, and you can get those worksheets to practice some of these strokes. So once I was done with drills, I decided to move on to actual words. I know that really letters would be the in-between step, but I feel like I show a lot of ABCs on this channel, so I didn't want to bore you if you've been here for a while. What I'm using here is a page out of my 1,000 plus words worksheets for large brush pens. I'll leave the link for those below if you're interested, but be forewarned, they are huge because there's a lot of words in them. But I like to make things as helpful as I can, so I packed them full. And yes, if you are wondering, my hand was very, very, very sore when I was done making these. So when I'm hand lettering, I like to turn my page to the side where I'm in this kind of natural position. I like to have a big range of motion when I bend my elbow to move my arm back and forth. I also like to lift my pen very often. Now, this might be a personal preference for some, but I also think that it can be a game changer in hand lettering. So if you've been trying to write a word without lifting your pen, similar to how you might do in cursive, then maybe try this and see how it works for you. I don't lift my pen in the middle of a stroke like when I'm going from thick to thin, but I do lift it after almost every stroke. One thing that I also want to point out is the speed in which you write. If you've seen lettering videos on Instagram or YouTube, you may not always realize that they're sped up. I know that some are obviously sped up, but I can speed up my lettering to about 4 times without it being super obvious. Yet if I tried to letter that fast, it would probably be a disaster. So when you see a video that looks like this, it actually probably started out more like this. In fact, let me just compare side by side for you to show you the drastic difference. On the left, you have my real-time hand lettering, and on the right, you have my hand lettering sped up by 8 times. I'd say 4 to 8 times speed is pretty normal for the things that I post, especially when I'm trying to fit something into a 1-minute time limit on Instagram. Here's what it looks like at 4 times. As you can see, if you are watching that by itself, it could be easy to think that that's somebody's actual hand lettering, but it's 4 times faster than I actually went. So if you've ever tried to follow along with a lettering artist and struggled to make the same smooth strokes, maybe you are just trying to go too fast. You don't have to go as slow as me, but I would recommend trying to slow down a little bit and see if it helps. I'm super curious to know what questions you have about lettering with these types of markers. And again, if you're wanting to learn to letter but haven't joined my free beginner lettering course, make sure to do that by going to howtohandletter.com/mini course or following the link below. I'll also link the 2 worksheet sets that I use here. The first one is from my Simplified Lettering Beginner Bundle, which I highly recommend for beginners. And the second is from the 1,000 plus words worksheets for large brush pens. I also should mention that I have these printed on a somewhat smooth paper. I typically use the HP Premium papers. I will link those below, but sometimes people wonder why their marker doesn't come out looking the same. And I do think having a smooth paper helps with it gliding across the paper, so that's just something to consider if you haven't already. Make sure to follow me over on Instagram for more lettering tips at How to Hand Letter. And thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in my next video.